The winter of 1888 came down on the Dakota Plains like a hammer. It was not a gentle slide into dormancy, no soft blanket of snow settling over a sleeping land. It was a declaration of war. The wind, born in the barren lands of the north, traveled for 1,000 miles with nothing to slow it, nothing to warm it, and arrived at the small settlement of Prairie Ridge as a physical force, a wall of invisible ice that struck the flimsy log cabins and demanded entry. It did not knock. It seeped through the chinking, whistled in the eaves, and laid a film of frost on the inside of the walls, a beautiful and deadly lacework of winter's art. For the settlers, survival was a simple, brutal equation of wood versus cold. The heart of every home was the cast-iron box stove, a squat, black beast that was perpetually hungry. It devoured split logs with a roar, glowing a dangerous cherry red in its center, blasting a circle of scorching heat a few feet around it. Beyond that circle, the cold held its territory. A man could burn his shins, while the back of his neck felt the frozen breath of the room. It was an inefficient, angry heat, a desperate fight waged yard by yard within one's own home. The woodpiles, stacked as high as a man's head in October, seemed to melt away like snow in a spring thaw. The problem was universal. In every cabin, the same struggle played out. Men spent their days with an axe in hand, the rhythmic thud of steel on wood, a constant hollow prayer against the encroaching freeze. Women spent their time feeding the stove, their hands chapped and raw from the constant cycle of handling frigid logs and then getting too close to the searing iron. Children lived their lives huddled in blankets, their world shrunk to the small patch of floorboards near the stove, their faces flushed on one side and pale on the other. They were a community united by a shared, failing strategy. They fought the cold with more fire, and the fire demanded more wood, and the dwindling woodpile was a measure of how many days they had left. Elias Brandt watched this struggle with quiet, analytical eyes. He was an outsider, a German immigrant who had arrived 2 years prior with his wife, who was now buried on the small hill overlooking the settlement, and his young daughter, Anna. He was a watchmaker by trade, a man accustomed to tiny gears and delicate springs, to the logic of interconnected parts working in quiet harmony. His neighbors saw him as a curiosity, a man whose skills were useless on the prairie. He was too slight for the heavy work of breaking sod, too quiet for the boisterous talk at the general store. They treated him with a kind of gentle pity, especially now that he was alone with the girl. Anna was the center of his world, a small, bright flame he was terrified the winter would extinguish. He saw the way the cold crept into their cabin, the way she shivered even when bundled in her thickest woolens. He watched the woodpile shrink and felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. He knew the box stove was a fool's bargain. It was a machine for burning wood, not for heating a home. It threw its heat away as fast as it made it, sending most of it straight up the stovepipe to be stolen by the relentless wind. He would not let Anna spend another winter as a prisoner in a 5-foot circle of warmth. One evening, after Anna was asleep, he unrolled a piece of drafting paper on his small table. By the light of a kerosene lamp, he began to draw. He did not draw a bigger stove. He drew something that looked, to the untrained eye, like a maze. It was a series of channels, of baffles and chambers, all contained within a rectangular mass of brick and clay. It was a memory from his childhood in the old country, a cockalofen, a masonry heater. The principle was not brute force, but elegant efficiency. A small, hot fire would be burned quickly. The hot gases, instead of rushing up a chimney, would be forced to travel a long, winding path through the brick interior, transferring their heat to the masonry mass before exiting. The stove itself would become a gentle, radiant sun, warming the entire room for hours after the fire was long dead. The next day he went to the general store to purchase fire bricks and flue liners. Thomas Miller, the settlement's most respected builder, was there, holding court by the pot-bellied stove. Thomas was a large man, confident in his craft and his opinions. He had built half the cabins in Prairie Ridge, and he built them the way his father had: thick logs, tight notches, and a big stove in the middle. He saw the bricks Elias was counting out. "What are you building with those, Elias?" Thomas asked, his voice booming with friendly curiosity. "A new hearth?" Elias shook his head. He was not a man for public speeches. "A stove," he said simply. A few of the other men in the store chuckled. "A stove made of brick?" one of them scoffed. "It'll crack in the first freeze." Thomas waved a dismissive hand. "Now, let the man be. He's got his reasons, I'm sure." He turned to Elias, a patronizing smile on his face. "But son, a little stove like that, made of mud and brick? It won't throw any heat. You need a big firebox, good thick iron to hold it. That's how you fight a Dakota winter. You fight fire with fire." Elias tried to explain. He spoke of thermal mass, of heat exchange, of capturing the energy before it escaped. The words were clinical, precise. To the men in the store, they were just foreign nonsense. They understood the roar of a fire, the glow of hot iron. They did not understand the quiet, invisible science of retained warmth. "It will burn a thimble of wood," Elias finished, "and heat the house all day." This time, the laughter was not restrained. It filled the small store, bouncing off the shelves of canned goods and tools. Thomas Miller clapped a heavy hand on Elias's shoulder, his expression a mixture of pity and amusement. "A toy stove for a toy house, eh? Elias, you're a good man, but you're a clockmaker. You think in little wheels and springs. Winter out here is a big, simple beast. You can't trick it. You have to overpower it." He turned back to the other men. "He'll be begging for firewood come January, mark my words." Elias paid for his materials and left, the sound of their laughter following him out into the cold. He felt a sting of humiliation, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, hard resolve. They did not understand, but they would. He was not building this stove for them. He was building it for Anna. He began his work in the corner of his small cabin, a space he cleared by moving their only table and 2 chairs. The labor was slow and methodical. He was not a mason, but he had a watchmaker's patience and an engineer's mind. He laid the foundation first, a thick pad of stone and clay to insulate the wooden floor from the heat. His hands, accustomed to tweezers and tiny files, grew rough and sore from handling the heavy bricks and abrasive mortar. He worked late into the night, long after Anna was asleep, his world reduced to the scrape of his trowel and the precise placement of each brick. He built the firebox from the best fire bricks, lining it with a special mix of clay and sand he had spent days preparing. Then came the intricate part, the system of channels that snaked back and forth, up and down, inside the stove's core. This was the heart of the machine. Each baffle had to be angled just so, each channel sized perfectly to control the flow of the hot gases, to make them slow down, to force them to surrender their heat to the surrounding mass. To an observer, it would have looked like madness, a man building a complicated maze that would be sealed away forever. As the weeks passed and the autumn air grew sharper, the community watched his progress with a mixture of scorn and morbid curiosity. Children would peek in his window and run away giggling. Men would stop by on their way back from the woodlot, lean against his doorframe, and offer unsolicited advice. "It's too small, Elias. It'll never draw. The mortar will crumble. You need iron straps to hold it together. You're wasting good time. Winter's coming. You should be chopping wood." While Elias carefully, painstakingly laid his bricks, The rest of Prairie Ridge engaged in the familiar, frantic rituals of winter preparation. The air was filled with the ringing of axes and the groan of saws. Thomas Miller, leading by example, was adding a second layer of sod insulation to the north wall of his cabin, a fortress against the coming wind. He was chinking every tiny gap in his logs with a mixture of mud and grass, his movements efficient and powerful. He would often glance over at Elias's cabin and shake his head, a look of genuine concern on his face. He saw a man lost in a foolish dream while a storm gathered on the horizon. He saw a father neglecting his primary duty, stockpiling wood, in favor of a bizarre and doomed experiment. Elias ignored them all. He sealed the inner core and began laying the outer shell of common brick. This was the second part of the design. The outer layer would heat up slowly, creating a safe, gentle surface that radiated warmth evenly into the room. It was designed to be touched, to be leaned against. There would be no circle of scorching heat and no frozen corners in his home. There would only be an even, consistent comfort. He designed a small, airtight cast-iron door for the firebox and a simple damper to control the airflow. The entire structure was no taller than his chest and barely 4 feet wide, a compact, unassuming block of reddish-brown brick in the corner of the room. He finished it in late November, just as the first serious snows began to fall. The final layer of plaster, a mix of clay and whitewash, gave it a clean, simple look. It stood there, silent and solid. Anna looked at it with wide, curious eyes. To her, it was just a strange, new piece of furniture. To the neighbors who saw it, it was Elias's folly, a monument to a foreigner's stubborn ignorance. They had finished their preparations. Their wood piles were immense, their cabins sealed as tightly as they could be. They were ready. They thought Elias was not. The first true test came with a cold snap in early December. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero, and the wind howled. Elias knew it was time. He loaded the small firebox with a few pieces of dry, seasoned hardwood, far fewer than he would have stuffed into the old box stove. He lit the kindling and closed the airtight door. For a few moments, nothing happened. Then he heard it, a low, deep rumble from within the bricks. It was not the roar of a conventional fire, but the sound of efficient, complete combustion. A jet of flame shot sideways through the channels, a controlled, intense burn. He let it burn hot and fast for an hour and a half. Following the design, he then closed the damper, starving the fire of oxygen and sealing the heat inside the masonry core. The fire went out. The rumble stopped. And then, a profound silence. Outside, the wind shrieked. Inside, the brick stove began its slow, steady work. An hour later, a gentle, radiant heat began to flow from its surfaces. It was a warmth unlike any he had felt in this land. It did not blast or scorch. It filled the room softly, consistently, wrapping around them like a woolen blanket. Anna, who usually had to be bribed to move away from the old stove, was soon playing with her dolls on the far side of the room, perfectly comfortable. Elias put his hand on the stove's surface. It was pleasantly, deeply warm, but not hot enough to burn. It worked. It worked exactly as he knew it would. Then came the storm. It was not just a storm. It was a legend that would be passed down for generations, a blizzard spoken of in hushed, fearful tones. It began on a gray afternoon in the first week of January, with the sky turning a strange, bruised yellow, and the wind falling into an eerie silence. The old-timers knew the signs. It was the calm before a plains blizzard, the deep breath before the scream. Within an hour, the world vanished. Snow did not fall. It flew horizontally, a blinding, scouring torrent of white, driven by a wind that rose to a terrifying, sustained roar. It was a physical assault, a relentless pressure against the cabins. The temperature, which had been a tolerable 10 degrees, plummeted. It fell to 0, then 10 below, then 20, then 30 below 0, and it kept falling. The wind chill was a number that had no meaning, a level of cold that was not just a threat to comfort, but to life itself. It was a cold that killed. Inside the cabins of Prairie Ridge, the desperate battle began. The box stoves, which had been merely inefficient, now became tyrants. They had to be fed constantly, a log every 15 or 20 minutes, just to keep the cold at bay. The wind, like a thief, found its way through every crack, every seam. It stole the heat almost as soon as it was produced. The moment the fire died down, the temperature in the cabins would plunge. Drafts cut through the air like knives. Water froze solid in buckets only a few feet from the glowing stoves. In Thomas Miller's cabin, the situation was grim. He had built it himself. It was the sturdiest home in the settlement, but it was losing the war. He and his wife worked in a frantic, sleepless rotation. One would stoke the fire while the other tried to rest, huddled with their 3 children under a mountain of blankets. The stove glowed red, consuming the massive woodpile at an alarming rate. Yet the walls were coated in a thick layer of feathery ice. The wind screamed through the log walls, a constant, mocking reminder of their failure. They were trapped in a shrinking circle of heat, their world reduced to a desperate, smoky cage. They were burning through a winter's worth of wood in a matter of days. Other families fared worse. Some ran out of easily accessible firewood and began burning fence posts, then furniture. The cold was a predator, and it was winning. The settlement was being dismantled from the inside out, its people isolated in their own small pockets of frozen misery, each family fighting the same losing battle, unaware of their neighbor's equally desperate plight. In Elias Brandt's cabin, there was peace. The storm raged outside, its fury a distant, muffled roar. But inside, a different world existed. Twice a day, once in the morning and once in the evening, Elias had burned a small, hot fire for just over an hour. The brick stove, his quiet, unassuming creation, absorbed the heat and then radiated it back into the small space with unwavering consistency. The air was still. The warmth was even, a gentle presence that filled every corner. There were no drafts, no frozen zones. The interior temperature held steady at a comfortable 67 degrees. Anna was not huddled in fear. She sat at the table Elias had moved back into place, drawing pictures on a piece of paper. She wore a simple woolen dress, no coat, no extra blankets. Elias sat in his chair, reading a book on mechanics he had brought from the old country. The contrast was absolute. Outside, nature was in a state of murderous chaos. Inside, there was a small, defiant island of civilization, of order, and of profound warmth. The stove was not fighting the storm. It had created a space where the storm did not matter. The blizzard howled for 2 days and 3 nights without pause. On the 3rd day, the wind began to subside, though the cold remained, a deep and bitter presence that settled over the land. It was during this fragile lull that Thomas Miller's axe handle broke. The head, weakened by the intense cold, shattered the wood as he tried to split a frozen log inside his cabin. It was the final indignity. His wood was running low, his family was sick with cold, and now his primary tool was broken. He remembered that Elias, the watchmaker, was good with his hands. He probably had a spare handle, or could fix the old one. It was a thin excuse, but it was enough. He had to get out. He had to see. He bundled himself in every layer of clothing he owned and stepped out into a world of alien white. The snow was drifted as high as the roofs, the landscape rendered unrecognizable. He fought his way through the deep powder, the air so cold it burned his lungs. He stumbled toward Elias's cabin, expecting the worst. He imagined finding them huddled together, frozen, another tragedy for the prairie to claim. He feared he would see no smoke from the chimney and know that their little toy stove had failed. But as he drew closer, he saw a thin, lazy wisp of smoke rising from the stovepipe. It was not the thick, panicked plume of a stove being fed for its life. It was a calm, almost leisurely exhalation. He reached the door, his beard a solid mass of ice, and knocked. He heard a chair scrape, and the door opened. Elias stood there, wearing only a shirt and trousers. The first thing that hit Thomas was not a blast of heat. It was a solid, gentle wall of warmth. It was not the dry, scorching air from his own stove, but a comfortable, slightly humid warmth that felt impossibly luxurious. He stared past Elias and saw the impossible. He saw the girl, Anna, playing on the floor with wooden blocks, her cheeks rosy and warm. He saw no blankets, no huddles of misery. He saw a home. He stumbled inside, overwhelmed. The difference was staggering, a shock to his system. His own cabin, a few hundred yards away, was a frozen battlefield. This place was a sanctuary. He looked at the brick stove in the corner. It was not glowing. It was not roaring. It was just there. Solid, quiet, and radiating a life-giving heat that seemed to defy every law of nature he understood. He looked at Elias's wood box. It was still more than half full. "How?" Thomas whispered, his voice hoarse. It was the only word he could manage. He looked from the stove to the comfortable child to the impossibly small woodpile. The evidence was irrefutable. He was wrong. He had been completely, utterly, and dangerously wrong. Elias Brandt did not smile in triumph. He did not say, "I told you so." He simply closed the door against the cold and gestured to a chair. "Sit, Thomas," he said, his voice calm. "I will make you some coffee." The quiet act of hospitality, the simple offer of a warm drink in a warm room, was more powerful than any words of victory. It was a gesture of grace that laid Thomas Miller's pride to rest. He sat down, stripped off his icy gloves, and held his trembling hands out to the impossible warmth of the brick stove. He had come looking for an axe handle, but he had found an answer. When the storm finally broke and the sun shone weakly on the buried landscape, word began to spread. It started with Thomas. He went home not with a new axe handle, but with a new understanding. He described what he had seen to his wife, then to his closest neighbors as they began to dig themselves out. At first, they were skeptical. It sounded like a fever dream, a story born of desperation and cold. But Thomas Miller was not a man given to fantasy. His reputation for sober, practical judgment was unassailable. And their own recent memory of suffering was too raw, their own woodpiles too terrifyingly small. Curiosity overcame their pride. One by one, then in small groups, the people of Prairie Ridge made their way to Elias Brandt's cabin. They came with excuses, just as Thomas had, to borrow a cup of flour, to ask about a stray cow. But their real purpose was to see the stove. They would step inside, and the same wave of disbelief would wash over them. They would halt in the doorway, feeling the gentle, pervasive warmth, seeing the comfortable child, and staring at the small, unassuming brick structure in the corner. They walked around it, touching its surface tentatively. They were used to the idea that life-giving heat had to be dangerously hot. This was different. This was a deep, penetrating warmth, a friendly heat. They peppered Elias with questions. "How much wood did you burn? Did it stay warm all night? Did the bricks not crack?" Elias answered each question patiently, without a trace of arrogance. He explained the principles again, but this time they listened. They listened with the rapt attention of students who who had just failed a brutal examination. He spoke of the long, winding flue that acted like an intestine, digesting the heat from the smoke. He spoke of the masonry mass acting like a stone battery, storing the energy of a short, hot fire and releasing it slowly over many hours. He made it sound simple, logical, inevitable. The men who had laughed at him in the general store now stood in his cabin, silent and humbled, their hats in their hands. The turning point came a week later. Thomas Miller appeared at Elias's door again. This time, he did not come with an excuse. He held a pencil and a small, leather-bound notebook. His face was serious, his posture deferential. He looked at the quiet watchmaker, the man he had publicly ridiculed, and uttered two words that would change the future of the entire settlement. "Teach me." It was a complete surrender of pride, a public admission of his own ignorance. Thomas, the master builder, was asking the outsider, the dreamer, to be his student. Elias simply nodded and invited him in. He did not ask for payment. He did not demand an apology. He saw a community that was suffering and knew he had a way to help. That was enough. He gave his knowledge away as freely as the stove gave its heat. He drew the plans again, this time in Thomas's notebook, explaining the function of every brick, every angle. He took Thomas outside and showed him the right kind of clay to find near the creek bed, the right kind of sand to mix for the mortar. He demonstrated how to build the inner core, the most critical part. Thomas, for his part, was a dedicated student. He absorbed every detail, his practical builder's mind quickly grasping the mechanical genius of the design. He asked sharp, insightful questions, not of doubt, but of understanding. That spring, as the prairie thawed and came back to life, a new sound was heard in Prairie Ridge. It was the sound of construction, but it was not the usual work of patching roofs or raising barns. Led by Thomas Miller, who was now Elias's most vocal and knowledgeable advocate, a team of men began to build new stoves. They started in the homes of the widows and the families with the most children, the ones who had suffered the most during the blizzard. Elias worked alongside them, not as a boss, but as a quiet guide. He would check their work, offer a suggestion on the angle of a baffle, or demonstrate the proper consistency for the mortar. He let Thomas do most of the talking, translating the watchmaker's precise concepts into the practical language of a builder. The community, which had once been united in its skepticism, was now united in its adoption of the new way. The sight of men working together, mixing mortar and laying bricks, became a symbol of their shared humility and newfound wisdom. By the time the first snows of the following winter arrived, more than half the cabins in Prairie Ridge had a Miller stove, as they began to call it, though Thomas always corrected them. "It's the Brandt heater," he would insist. The change was transformative. The constant, back-breaking labor of chopping wood was drastically reduced. The homes were no longer zones of heat and cold, but places of consistent, comfortable warmth. Children could play freely. Families could sit down to dinner without huddling around a scorching iron box. The fear of winter, the deep, gnawing anxiety that had defined their lives, began to recede. The story of the immigrant stove did not remain in Prairie Ridge. A traveling preacher, staying overnight in a cabin warmed by one of the new heaters, was astonished by its efficiency. He took the story with him to the next settlement, and the one after that. A government surveyor, mapping the territory, saw the design, made detailed sketches in his logbook, and shared them with homesteaders hundreds of miles away. The idea spread, not through newspapers or official channels, but from one person to another, a piece of essential folk knowledge passed along the frontier. It was a quiet revolution of warmth and wisdom. Years later, Elias Brandt was an old man. His daughter Anna was grown, with children of her own. He sat in his chair, in the same small cabin, warmed by the same brick stove he had built so long ago. It stood in the corner, a silent, faithful servant, its whitewashed surface now stained with the smoke of thousands of fires. The settlement of Prairie Ridge had grown into a proper town, and nearly every home had a masonry heater of some kind, each one a descendant of his original design. The laughter from the general store was a distant, faded memory, replaced by decades of quiet respect. He had learned that winter that the prairie demanded more than just brute strength and stubbornness. It demanded cleverness. It demanded observation. It demanded the humility to accept that a new idea, no matter how strange it seemed, might hold the key to survival. The greatest force on the plains was not the wind or the cold. It was the quiet power of a better way, a truth that, once seen, could not be ignored. The warmth that filled his home was more than just a matter of physics and thermal mass. It was the enduring warmth of a lesson well learned.